Great. Okay, I see we're recording. So I'll begin. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this webinar today. My name is Monica Westin. I work in outreach and partnerships at Google Scholar, and I'm really pleased to be talking with you about how to make sure your OJS journals are as well indexed as possible. Broadly, what I'll be going over is first how the Google Scholar indexing system works to index OJS articles. I'll go through some common OJS indexing problems and suggested fixes. At the end, I'll describe a few best practices for OJS journal indexing. And finally, I'll point you to some really good indexing guidelines and resources, both at Google Scholar and elsewhere, that will help you understand both the best practices and the reasoning behind them. At the end, there will be plenty of time for questions. So as I talk, if you think of questions, you can put them into the Q&A box. So I want to begin by describing how the Google Scholar indexing system works, which is to crawl the web looking for scholarly content, identifying associated metadata for that content, and grouping different items together in Google Scholar search results. In order to do this, first, a crawler is always scanning the entire web looking for items that seem scholarly. For all scholarly items, the indexing system then identifies suitable bibliographic metadata, which it displays in Google Scholar search results for that item. So what does the Scholar system need to find your journals, your articles, and include them in search results? I described how it crawls the web, which means first, the crawler needs to be able to get to all of the article URLs. This is done via browse or sitemaps. And for most instances of OJS, this is set up by default. I'll go into a few exceptions later. Second, in order to identify metadata for the publications that it finds, the Scholar system needs access to machine-readable metadata for these items. This machine-readable metadata used by Scholar is called Metatags. It takes the form of citation underscore. The image on the right shows a typical set of metatags. It's taken from our inclusion guidelines, which I'll make sure to share with you later. The metatags in the green box contain familiar bibliographic metadata like title, author, publication date. The last metatag at the bottom in the red box tells the indexing system the location of the full text version of the article. So the file that all of this metadata belongs to is associated with. These meta tags are usually automatically built in for OJS journals, though I will describe some exceptions. You can review the meta tags for your articles by going to the landing page for the article, then viewing the HTML source. Usually you do this by right-clicking on the page and selecting View Page Source, or depending on your browser, a keyboard command. Once you're on the HTML source page, which you see a screenshot at the bottom of the HTML source for this article, you can search for all instances of citation underscore to see the list of meta tags. This process is what is used to test and troubleshoot many of the OJS indexing errors that I'm going to describe in this presentation. And it's actually how I do a lot of testing at Google Scholar on my side. When you review the meta tags for an article, you'll always want to compare them to the metadata in the PDF of the article. The PDF is considered the version of record and the ground truth for the scholarly item. So in this example, these meta tags look great, and I'll tell you why. Hopefully it's not too small to see. First, the publication dates outlined in red match. So the citation date tag gives the date of April 20th, 2019. And at the bottom of the PDF on the right, you can see the publication date is April 2019. Note that because the abstract, which is outlined here in blue, is written in Portuguese, so are the meta tags. Notice especially the title meta tag is written in the same language, also outlined in blue, and the citation language meta tag is blue. I'll go into detail about these best practices soon. I just want you to have an example of what it looks like when everything looks good. The publication date and the article meta tags, in addition to matching the PDF, should also match the publication date for the issue in which the article was published. So as you see here, volume 13, issue 1 of this journal was published in 2019. the Google Scholar indexing system will check to make sure that articles within this issue also all have a publication date listed with the year 2019 in the meta tags. And again, this is an example where it's working well. So I've spent quite a bit of time really early on talking about bibliographic meta tags because this is a very common error when it comes to Scholar indexing for OJS articles. So indexing in Google Scholar requires accurate meta tags for indexing to work. Inaccurate, incorrect metadata is not just going to result in unhappy authors and items not being ranked as they should be due to missing citations, but this indexing system also automatically detects sites with frequent metadata errors. If these are widespread enough, it stops including them. So if your OJS journal site has been dropped from the Scholar index, it may be due to widespread frequent metadata errors that are causing problems for the indexing system. There are a few other common causes for OJS indexing errors like site outages, obstructing a crawler. I'll talk a bit about some recent hacking that we've seen for OJS sites. I'll go into those at the end of the presentation. But for now, the bulk of what I want to talk about is common errors for metadata for OJS. So first is the publication date. And I would say this might be the most common issue that we see for OJS journals. The publication date is obviously a crucial piece of metadata for indexing scholarly articles. If the publication date in the citation date tag doesn't match the publication date of the issue or the publication date given in the PDF, it's a red flag for the indexing system. And here you see a typical example that I would come across, where the publication date in the meta tag, which says 2019, is later than the actual publication date for the item, which is 2016. This suggests that the date the PDF was made available online or uploaded is accidentally being listed as a publication date. This is a common type of publication date error, and it's not just for when you're loading back content. There's also a known bug. So there are a few different versions of OJS that cause incorrect dates to be listed in the meta tags. And I'll go to the next slide to describe this. So if you're using any version of OJS 3.0 or 2.4, and you have widespread date errors in the meta tags across your site, this bug is likely the cause. To test for this, you would review the HTML source for your articles to view the date meta tags. I would test a number of randomly selected articles, both recent and archival, across your journals, then compare them with the publication dates listed in the PDF and the publication dates for the issue. If you're finding that the dates are wrong and this is widespread across your site, and you're currently using one of the OJS versions listed here, there is a patch that's been developed specifically to fix this problem. And what this patch does is to ensure that only the publication date is used in the citation date meta tag. And of course, if you can upgrade to a new version of OJS, that's also extremely helpful, and that will solve this problem. So I said at the beginning of this presentation that meta tags are usually enabled by default for OJS. However, there's been a recent widespread issue that happened in the last 6 to 8 months for some upgrades to newer versions of OJS. And so this is affecting, well, I have the versions listed here, but in these cases, the Google Scholar plugin that creates meta tags for OJS articles was disabled during the upgrade. This was unintentional. So even if the meta tags were enabled on the previous version, it would drop them in the upgrade. So if your OJS site has upgraded to any version of OJS listed here, it's a good idea to check if your journals have been affected by this issue. The best way to check is to search for the citation_title in the HTML source to search for, and I would do this across maybe a couple different articles. If there's no title meta tag for these, you've likely been affected by the disabled plugin. And again, this has happened relatively recently, and attendees on this call may well be affected and not know. So there are a few different ways to fix this issue depending on how many journals you publish. I would say if the collection of journals on your OJS site is small enough that you're able to make a simple manual adjustment for each journal, that's the easiest solution. And I'll walk you through that process on the next slide. Otherwise, if you have so many journals on your OJS site, then making a change for each individual journal will take too much time. And I know there are some attendees here who have dozens or even more of journals. You can use an SQL command to adjust the database all at once. Finally, you can upgrade to a new version of OJS. So 3.1.2 and newer has the fix for this bug already built in. But I'll walk through the simplest fix for this, which is enabling the Google Scholar plugin manually on a journal-by-journal basis. You'll start by logging into the administrator dashboard for each journal. From the Plugins tab, find the list of generic plugins and check the Google Scholar indexing plugin box at the right. You can see it's pretty small. Be sure to save your settings and repeat for every affected journal. I would say the third most common problem that we come across is different kinds of language errors. I'll describe two. So another common error for OJS journals occurs when multiple languages or scripts are combined in the meta tags for a single article. And this results in mixed, often duplicate bibliographic information. It causes confusion both for the Scholar indexing system, but also crucially for end users. So someone may, for example, click on a Scholar search result that seems to be an article written in a familiar language and end up on a PDF they can't read. Along the same lines, using English as the default for meta tags, regardless of the language of the article, will also cause problems for indexing. This will also result in mixed citations because articles that cite the article, well, for example, on the right, you see this Portuguese article, and I've given an example of putting the title meta tag in English. So articles that cite the article you see here will likely use the Portuguese title in the citations. And so those missing citations mean the articles won't be ranked as high as they should in Scholar search results. And of course, all of these will result in unhappy authors, unhappy end users, and it is a red flag for the indexing system. So the fix for both of these language issues is to always use the language of the full text in the PDF as a guide for the language to use when you're entering the metadata for a publication. So this would be both the language and the script that you use, depending on where you're publishing. Don't duplicate this information in different languages or scripts within a single field. Keep one version of that information in the language of the article. Slightly less commonly, although we do come across this quite a bit, are badly formatted author names. So when author names in the citation author meta tags don't match the author names in the published PDF, this is another red flag for the Scholar indexing system. So here in the red meta tags, you see a few different examples of common author name errors. All of these will break indexing. In the first meta tag, notice that the author's first name and last name have been inverted. In the second, only part of the author's name has been entered. And in the last, a lowercase spelling has been used for the author's name. To troubleshoot and fix, you'll compare the author names listed in the meta tags with the author names in the PDF. If you see discrepancies, always adjust the meta tags to match the PDF, which is again the version of record. Keep a close eye on first name, last name format, and capitalization. I included this because I've seen a number of these, especially quite recently. We do come across invalid HTTPS certificates. So indexing HTTPS sites requires a valid server certificate, and an invalid certificate effectively blocks the crawler from accessing the site. This forces the indexing system to remove the site from crawling as a result. So the impact is immediate and very high. To test, you want to open the URL for an article from one of your journals. You don't need to test all of your journals, but pick an article or two and open in a few different browsers. See if you see any messages about the connection not being private. I have an example here from Chrome and from Safari. If so, you need to work with the certificate provider to resolve the issue. Finally, the last common problem, which I mentioned has been pretty widespread recently, is actually, maybe I didn't yet. pretty recently, we've seen some widespread issues of hacked OJS sites. And this does happen from time to time, where the they're basically getting spam returned to the crawler. And this is used for commercial spamming. So the indexing system identified almost 150 OJS sites that have been hacked and used for commercial spamming this year. The OJS sites often don't look hacked to journal managers and end users because articles will load normally in the browser. However, the crawler, and this is both for Google Scholar and for Google Web Search, is receiving links to spammy pages instead of the actual journal content. The indexing system is forced to drop these hacked sites. So if it looks okay to the end user and the journal manager, how do you test? To test, you'll need to emulate the crawler to see what the crawler sees by setting your user agent to Googlebot. Then you can check URLs for a selection of articles across your journals to see if they return anything other than the article page you see in the browser. If you do notice some odd content, alerting your hosting provider is the best first step. They should be able to analyze and fix any underlying security issues that are causing this issue. And we have seen so far a few different security problems. Next, we recommend posting on the PKP community forum, of course, PKP who run OJS. I would share your situation with others and ask for assistance there if needed. It would be good to see if others have had similar problems and potential solutions if you are able to find the security flaw in your system. So with that, we've covered a large portion of indexing errors that tend to affect OJS journals. I'll describe one more at the very end of my talk, but I want to turn now to some best practices for OJS publishing that will make sure that your articles are as well indexed as possible. One really common question about Google Scholar indexing that I get is whether OJS journals need to register their OJS site in order to be indexed. The answer is no. The Scholar crawler, as I said, automatically is scanning the entire web for scholarly items all the time. It may occasionally take a bit of time, but it will eventually find your publications. However, you can ensure that your journals are as indexed as quickly and comprehensively as possible by using the standard OJS structure that the Scholar indexing system has learned to recognize. OJS allows customization of URL paths, and some journals do use this. But customizing URLs makes it harder for the crawler to identify OJS-based journals. So we recommend against customizing these URLs. Here's an example of a standard URL at the bottom that we see. Notice the PHP, notice the article view, and the short name for the journal. And then the identifier at the end. If your OJS site migrates to another domain or subdomain, or you're renumbering articles or giving new identifiers to articles, it's important to minimize broken links as much as possible. That means setting up redirects at the article level, so not just from all the old URLs to the home page of the new journal. So this would go from the previous article URL to the new article URL. These redirects would also be permanent, so you would want them to be HTTP 301s and not 302s. Here, you can see an example of a well-organized site migration where the old URL for an article points to the new URL for the article on the new domain. Another best practice during migrations is to keep the old site functional and live while the new site is being developed to avoid interruptions in access for both researchers and the indexing system. So when the new site is ready to go live, first put the article level redirects in place, then change the DNS lookup to the new server. And that leads me to sort of the last common issue that's related to migrations, and I'll end there. And this is site outages. And I actually wanted to give some examples from real Google Scholar crawl logs to illustrate. So whenever your site is down, it doesn't just cause problems for researchers trying to access the publications who will end up on dead pages. It prevents the indexing system from crawling them. So in general, try to avoid keeping your site down for more than a few hours to lower the chances that the crawler will be trying to find your publications while they're inaccessible. Repeated site outages, even if only for a few hours, can obstruct indexing. Here you see a real example from the Google Scholar crawl log showing a journal site that was intermittently down over a period of days. Notice that after this happens, let's see, 4 or 5 times, the crawler visits the page less frequently, and it basically starts to give up on indexing the site. If it tries to return to this URL or to these URLs on the site over and over and can't find anything, it will start to behave as though this site is dead, is no longer active. And then one more, extended outages. They can lead the indexing system to believe that your site is completely inactive. If your site has been down for extended periods of time, it's possible that it has been dropped from the index entirely. So before we turn to questions, and I know there are a couple of questions already in the Q&A box. By the way, if you put your questions in chat, please cut and paste them into the Q&A box. Before we turn to questions, I want to end by directing you to a few useful references and guidelines about Scholar indexing. The first is our online Google Scholar documentation. So if you go to scholar.google.com and click Help on the bottom right this corner of the page, you're taken to our documentation. From there, the section titled Inclusion will provide a comprehensive overview of the indexing process. It includes the example list of meta tags I showed you, along with the troubleshooting guidelines I talked about today, plus a few more. I also recommend a slide deck from a presentation that our founder Anurag gave at the Open Repositories Conference a few years ago. It is targeted to repository platforms and describes some repository-specific issues, but it also has good general guidelines for indexing best practices, most of which are extremely relevant to OJS. Finally, the creators of OJS, Public Knowledge Project, or PKP, has set up a community forum where you can post specific questions that others using the platform may have encountered. And I know that the forum is really active, and developers for OJS are always kind of looking at the forum. So your voice is heard and can lead to having really good technical help, even development requests. So with that, we'll turn to questions. I want to make sure that everyone on this webinar has my email address. If you are having issues with your OJS site not being indexed, you're not sure why, and you've done all the troubleshooting in this webinar that I went over, send me an email and I'll be happy to look at your site. And I think now we can turn to questions. And Arena, I'm happy to just answer the questions myself, unless maybe you can keep an eye to see if I missed something.
Thanks a lot, Monica. Yeah, sure. Please start answering, and I'll keep an eye if there is something more in the box.
Sounds good. I think I need to stop share in order to see the Q&A. Okay. So first question from Vanessa Gabler. Do parentheses and author names cause a problem? E.g., Elena, do errors result in missing information on the scholar citation, or would the article be excluded completely? That's a great question. In general, you don't want to put parentheses in the bibliographic meta tags. This would be seen as trailing information, sort of trailing irrelevant information to the indexing system. Instead, what I would do is I would match the name given in the meta tag to whatever is listed in the PDF. In terms of would the article be excluded completely, the Google Scholar indexing system, will not catch every error. So it's possible that you could have this done once or twice and it wouldn't be caught. But if this is very common, that you're adding this sort of trailing information in the meta tags, it's likely that this would cause red flags for indexing, which would mean that the article could be dropped, that the site could be dropped. In terms of your question about the citation, it sort of depends. This could result in the article not being cited correctly and capturing the right citations. But yes, that's also a possibility. So great question. Second question from Pedro. For the citation meta tags, what happens if the journal only uses volume year and no issue? Will Google Scholar index it? Yes, great question. We know a lot of journals will only use the volume and year. In that case, all you'll need to do is make sure that there are no date errors in terms of matching the PDF and the citation date tag to the year of the volume. And then we have an example of an article. And if it's okay, I'll look at that, Pedro, I'll look at that offline. I'll be happy to look and see. But basically that looks like a very standard OJS site to me. You have the host, the domain, you have index.php. I'm guessing MYB is the journal, then article view, and then an identifier that looks like an ID or a handle. Question from Krista. How do you know if your journal has been dropped by Google Scholar? And if you have been dropped, can you get on again? Great question. So the best way to tell if your journal has been dropped by Google Scholar is to just search Google Scholar for your site. I can actually show how to do that, if that will be helpful. So, can everyone see the Scholar search bar?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's see. I know I have a colleague from eScholarship here. So you could search site : to search the domain for all articles under your site. And so you'll see here there are 109,000 search results. So if you know that you have many more articles than that, then you would want to start looking to see, are there particular journals that aren't being indexed? Are there particular articles in particular journals that aren't being indexed? To search for particular articles, I would always search for the title in parentheses. But yeah, basically you'll start with site : and then go to your site to see. And it looks like there's another question in the chat. Another question from IC maybe? Oh, you know, for people putting questions in chat, can you put it into the Q&A because the chat is getting quite long? Okay, here we go. I'm going to go back to the Q&A, so just keep adding questions into the Q&A. A question from Faustina. My article is not published by a journal. Can it be indexed in Google Scholar? That's a great question. So Google Scholar doesn't just index published journals and published content. It also indexes repositories. So if your article is uploaded to your institutional repository, like a DSpace, we will index it there. Or if you add your article to say your faculty page, if you have a page on your university website where you post your articles, we can index it there. And Faustina, you'll want to look at the Google Scholar guidelines for uploading your own papers to your faculty page if you want to do it that way. Teresa says, so there's no need to register publications on Google Scholar. Crawlers will automatically find them, correct? Yes, this is correct. So eventually we will find everything. I would say if you have published, if you've been publishing in OJS and you have published multiple issues, everything seems to be working well, and you haven't been picked up by Google Scholar in like a year, send me an email at mwestin@google.com. I'll add my email again into the chat, and I can take a look. It usually would be within a few weeks or months that articles would be picked up. Very occasionally, it would take more than a few months. But feel free to email me. A great question from Maxim. What types of date formats are supported? Does 1996, February 15th, and 15th February 1996 both correct? The first is preferred. All other dates can be ambiguous. So you want year, month, date. Another question, will we be given this presentation? Yes, Arena mentioned that this will be posted to the EIFL website, both the slides and the recording.
And I will send you the link where you can download them. So no worries about that.
Sounds good. Another question from Faustina. Is there a linkage between Google Scholar, ResearchGate, and academia.edu? We do occasionally index PDFs that are posted there. Louise says, regarding metrics, do you count a visit to the HTML version and the PDF version as one visit or two visits? So we don't actually supply those kind of metrics. Louise, why don't you send me an email offline and we can talk more about this? I think the metrics you're asking for is probably not something that we can supply. A question from Marie Helene about OAI PMH. Yeah, so we are not using OAI PMH anymore. We are using crawling and Metatags. It's become extremely standard in publishing to use the HighWire Press, or what we call the HighWire Press or the Google Scholar Metatags. OAI PMH data for a number of different reasons, and I can get into this offline, is less ideal for Google Scholar indexing. Another question from IC about the URL, can this be indexed in Google Scholar? This looks a little bit odd to me. Let me take a look offline and get back to you, IC. Question from someone with the alias Realme 3 Pro. Is there any defined parameters used to index articles by Google Scholar as defined by similar indexing databases? I'm not quite sure what you mean. If you're referring to like the meta tags and the crawling, those are used by other platforms as well. Other sort of aggregators are using the same data to index. I wonder if that's what you mean. Gerda says, I just searched Google Scholar for my journal site, and there's no record of it at all. The site went live in July. We did not register the articles. This was not necessary. What do we need to do to be captured? Gerda, if it's been, let's see, July through November, it may be that the crawler hasn't found your site, but why don't you send me an email, Gerda? My email is in the chat, and send me a host for your site, and I'll take a look. Just the homepage for the OJS site.
There are also two questions, comments in the chat. There's the very last ones from Faustina. She was specifying H index and I10 index difference.
Sure. I can't speak to the I10 index. H index is the index that Google Scholar uses. There is more information in the Scholar documentation. I can't really say anything beyond what's in the public documentation, and it's a bit out of scope for this webinar. So if it's okay, I think I'd like to focus on OJS and indexing questions rather than the H index. But Faustina, if you go to the Scholar Help Guidelines, you'll see a lot more information about the H index.
And then there is a question about Google Analytics also in the chat.
Yeah, I think that's also a bit out of scope. There is a lot of public documentation about Google Analytics, and I don't actually work on that side of things. So I think the best thing to do is go in through the public documentation about Google Analytics.
Thanks. And we have 3 new questions from Pedro, Luis, and Mr. Bertay in Q&A.
Sounds good. Okay, question about a Google Scholar profile. Yeah, so we support Google Scholar profiles. It's not necessary to have a Google Scholar profile for your content to be indexed. Only with the plugin will be indexed. So this is what I was referring to with OJS case of lost meta tags. The lost meta tags will result in OJS articles not being indexed as they should be, being indexed poorly because they don't have any metadata, or not being indexed at all. That's separate from having a Google Scholar profile. Google Scholar supports creating profiles. Anyone can make one. The focus of this presentation is on, for your journals themselves, what do they need to do to be indexed? And they do need to have the meta tags set up well. Good question from Luis Carlos. Are Google Search Console and Google Scholar linked? No, so Google Search Console is for web search only. However, there is a function on the Search Console where you can fetch as Google to see what the Googlebot sees, and that actually applies to Google Scholar because we use the same crawler. However, the Search Console is just for web search. And last question, I love this question, is one likely to encounter the same indexing challenges about OJS with institutional repositories? The answer is yes. And Arena and I have just worked together along with some colleagues at Duraspace and Lyrasis about DSpace repositories. And Arena, you've attended those. You can probably confirm about half the errors are the same for DSpace and OJS.
Yeah, and if you want, in the follow-up email, I can include a link to Monica's presentation and to recording on common indexing issues with DSpace repositories.
That would be great. There are a number of DSpace user groups for which I've done a presentation on DSpace DSpace indexing errors, and Irina can include some links. Thank you so much, Irina. That's great.
I'll just take your latest English presentation.
Perfect.
Thanks. And I think we don't have any new questions so far. So if you want to ask Monica, that's probably the right moment to do so. And okay, there are some more, I guess.
Okay. Will it be possible to? Irina, why don't you take that one?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that we're recording this webinar, and I'll share the recording with everyone.
Great. Our OJS version, IC says, is 2.4.8. We don't use a standard URL. Can the journal be indexed in Google Scholar with a non-standard URL? Yes, it can. I'm guessing that we're probably finding your articles more slowly. So if I would search Google Scholar for a number of articles across your journals and see, are we indexing them? If it's been, say, more than a few months, certainly more than 6 months, and certainly if it's been a year and an article has been published and we haven't indexed it, drop me an email and let me know and I'll take a look.
Thanks. Any more questions? Yeah, there is a question from Maxime.
What's the best practice for a multilingual journal? Metatags only on the language article or many metatags on all languages? So the best practice is to have, for each PDF, have one language for each PDF. So right away, I recommend don't have abstracts in multiple languages. Have one abstract in the language of the full text. If you have translations of the article, you can publish it as a separate article with separate metadata in that language. Beyond that, it's absolutely fine to have a different language for each article in your journal. The problem is when you mush them together. So definitely have only one set of meta tags in the language of the full text. Keep the language in the full text. And this is both for indexing and for the end user. So a rule of thumb would be, if an end user using Google Scholar is a researcher is looking for this article and searching using this language, what should they land on? So if they're searching in, say, using Japanese, they don't want to then land on a different, an Italian version of the article. I hope that answered your questions, Maxine. Basically, the best practice is one language for each PDF. Meta tags in that language. Don't translate them either within a single meta tag or across multiple meta tags.
There is also a question from Krista after Maxime's question.
Great. We have English abstracts for all publications in different languages, so is that a problem? It's not a best practice. It should be okay as long as your meta tags are matching the language of the full text. I know this is a common practice to have English abstracts. We see it quite a lot. I would recommend against it because I think it can be a bit misleading for researchers if they come across the abstract and then end up clicking through and they're on a PDF they can't read. In terms of indexing, I would say as long as the meta tags match the full text, you'll be okay. And don't add extra English meta tags.
Vanessa added that Scopus requires English abstracts, and also there are some national requirements. For example, in Ukraine, in my country, it's required to have Ukrainian and English abstracts in a PDF or an article.
I see. Yeah, in that case, then I think if it's important to meet those requirements, absolutely keep the English abstract in. Just ensure that the meta tags are matching the full text.
Any other questions or comments? Thanks again, Monica, and thank you all for attending this webinar. So you still have a minute or two to type your questions if you haven't done this yet. And like we said, you will receive a link with slides and recording. And there will be Monica's email on the slides, and We also copied that email in a chat. If you want to email her earlier than you receive her slides. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for attending.
There is a question from Faustina. Are key concepts in articles searchable in text?
Oh, yeah. So for key, I think you're referring to key terms. Really, indexing is based on the full text. And so I would focus less on adding key terms than on making sure that the full text is well indexed. Google Scholar is matching queries to the full text and to the bibliographic metadata. Key terms are less important. Great question.
Thanks. So I think by now we've covered all the questions, and thanks again, Monica, for waking up so early, and thank you all for joining. I know that this timing is not ideal, but it's really hard if you want to cover more than one continent. So thanks again. I wish you a good rest of the day or evening or morning. Thank you all. Bye.
Bye. Thank you, Irina, for organizing. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I look forward to hearing from some of you. Bye.